Welcome to our HR in Action webinar series, and today we're talking about practical steps for performance feedback and coaching. Thank you for joining me. My name is Vicky Gutteridge. I'm the CEO at Citizens Advice Leicestershire. I'm also a Chartered Fellow of the CIPD and hold a Master's in Human Resources. So today we're going to be talking about important changes with the upcoming Employment Rights Act and why it's important to act now. We'll discuss how we can deliver feedback that motivates and inspires continual improvement, how we can use coaching techniques to set clear expectations and drive accountability, and how we can build habits that create a performance culture, whether you have a dedicated HR team or not. So, what is changing in the Employment Rights Act, and how does a performance culture support these changes? So, in January 2027, we will see changes to the unfair dismissal protections. Currently, employers will have 2 years to assess performance of new employees. In January 2027, this qualifying period drops from 2 years to 6 months to assess performance. After that 6 months, your employees will have unfair dismissal protections from January 2027. It's also important to note that currently the compensation is capped to 52 weeks of lost earnings. This compensation cap will be removed and full loss of earnings will be assessed at any tribunals. This is very important to understand, particularly with your higher salaried employees. So we also make the note that anybody that you are currently employing from the 1st of July this year and before will have accrued that 6 months employment protection from January 2027. So the legislation doesn't just tip into effect from January 2027. It applies to anybody in your organisation who already has 6 months continuous employment at that point in time. So it is really important now for employers to review their probation policies, their induction processes, and ensure that your line managers feel confident and competent in applying those processes fairly and consistently across the organisation. So that includes having regular check-ins, supervisions and one-to-ones, and documented evidence to show the progress against objectives so that you can see whether people are meeting the expectations of that role. So not only is this supportive for your employee because they understand very clearly what success looks like in that role, we will also be seeing employment tribunal claims extending from 3 months to 6 months. Now, if you ask me what I was doing 3 weeks ago, I think I'd have to have a good sit and think about that. So trying to remember what has happened 6 months previously is going to be quite difficult. So again, that reinforces the importance of having documented evidence of supervisions and check-ins and the progress against objectives. We also know that during the 6 month period, people may have left the organisation. So having those documents there, regardless of who remains in your organisation, is going to be really important if you need to engage with any tribunal processes. So in summary, anybody that you're employing from 1st of July this year or before will have already accrued those unfair dismissal protections by January 2027. So please start to think about reviewing your probation policy and induction processes now. So the real risk isn't the tribunal itself, it's what actually sits behind the tribunal. Prevention is the first line of defence, and having confident and competent managers who can apply your processes and policies fairly and consistently across the organisation is going to be really important to avoid going to any kind of formal process or engaging with tribunal requirements. So this is about managers who feel confident in having those early conversations and feedback, giving feedback where performance might not be meeting expectations. We know that people feel quite uncomfortable in having these conversations, but the longer you avoid that, the more problematic it becomes. It feels unfair for employees who have been working in your organisation for a number of months to then be told that they're not meeting expectations without any feedback prior to that. A leadership culture that confuses kindness with avoidance is the organisations that are going to be left exposed when it comes to the 6 months protections for unfair dismissal. So the organisations that will protect themselves are those who have managers that feel confident in applying those processes. So performance management can often feel uncomfortable and anxiety provoking for both the manager and the individual involved. And what we often see is that performance conversations and feedback are avoided and then brought up perhaps at an annual review many months later. And this creates confusion and frustration for that individual who have assumed that they're performing well and meeting the expectations of that role. This can then lead into more formal processes, such as capability processes, or from the individual's perspective, a grievance process because they don't feel as if they've been fairly treated. One thing to remember is once you step into those more formal processes, it is much harder to get a good outcome out of that. The higher you go up those formal process steps, it becomes more difficult to maintain good working relationships and repair those relationships and retention of members of staff who you have already invested a lot of time in. So a performance coaching culture can support having really early conversations and people understanding what success looks like in their role. We often use the radical candor matrix where we say we care deeply about our employees and we challenge directly by providing regular coaching opportunities in supervisions and probation reviews and by giving honest feedback on how their performance is progressing against clear objectives. It also then gives us time for early intervention, providing training and support so people can successfully pass that probation period. And this leads to high-performing teams with greater results. We often find that when you're engaging in formal processes, you've already had a system failure upstream by not having those clear expectations and early conversations right from the start. So how can managers manage this effectively? we find that there are three conversations that matter. One at the point of welcoming an employee into your organisation or at a point of being promoted into a new role. It's having those expectation conversations. What does good look like in that role? And be able to document that with clear objectives and clear timeframes for meeting certain progressions within that role. Don't assume people know what's expected. Set really clear targets. That is far kinder than avoiding having clear conversations with people. The second conversation is the feedback conversation. And it is far easier to have a feedback conversation when clear expectations have already been set. So feedback needs to be evidence-based and what that impact looks like if those objectives are not being performed to expectations. The feedback conversation should be specific. It should be two-way so that you can understand perhaps what barriers or challenges the team member is having in meeting those expectations. And then the third conversation is a coaching conversation. So where you have identified a gap between what good looks like and what's happening in reality, you can then discuss what options are available. And then that really helps people to commit to the agreed actions without having any mistaken expectations. So how could we carry this out practically? We can have a look at a scenario. Imagine that you manage a small team. One person is consistently missing deadlines. You've mentioned it informally twice, but nothing has changed, and you feel that the situation is getting worse. What conversation do you have first and how? Think about the expectations conversation, the feedback conversation, and the coaching conversation. We'll now walk through what we can do in this scenario. So the first conversation that we would want to have is the expectations conversation. If you are having issues with meeting performance, it's generally because expectations have not been clear from the start. So both parties need to agree what good looks like and how they will achieve that. The second conversation is the feedback conversation. So when you have identified a gap during that expectations conversation, you can then talk about what that actually looks like. Here's what the expectations are. Here's what's happening in practice. And this is the impact on the team, the organisation, or your customers. And then this leads nicely into the third conversation, which is the coaching conversation. And this will help us identify what we can do to help that person succeed in their role. So how do we have a feedback conversation? So what we need to look at is describing the specific context. If you are a fan of Simon Sinek, he uses a facts behavior impact rather than situation, and you can use whichever one resonates with you the best. So if we're looking at a situation where an employee perhaps is regularly coming into work late, we can describe the specific context. What we don't want to be saying is, you're late all of the time and it's creating a problem for your team. It's not specific enough. They could come back and say, well, I wasn't late yesterday or the day before. And you'd have to agree with that. And the power of that conversation has been lost. So the approach we would need to take is, on Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday this week, you were 20 minutes late. And that is a fact, it's evidence-based. Then we can look at what the behaviour is that we would like to see. So when you are struggling to get into work on time, there is a process where you must contact your manager and let them know what the problem is and what time you will be arriving. And then the manager can then discuss that when you arrive into work. So that's the behaviour. And the impact could be on Thursday mornings, we have a team meeting. Because you were late, you were unable to deliver your update, and that has prevented decisions being made and has slowed the progress down for all of your team. And perhaps this has impacted on your customer too. So we now have a clear what the situation is, what the behaviour is that you would want to see to meet expectations, and what the impact of that behaviour is in the organisation. So you have identified the gap between the expectation and what you need to see as good performance. So the next conversation we can have is around the solutions to that. So what is the goal? Being able to attend work promptly, or if you can't, being able to follow the process and what that looks like. What is the reality now? So we've identified that gap in the feedback conversation. What's working, what isn't, and what might be some of the challenges for your employee at that point in time. Is it childcare issues? Is it travel issues? And what are some of the options that could be done to try and resolve that problem that is mutually beneficial for both the employee and the manager and the team? It's important to know that when an individual is involved in setting those targets, being involved in looking at all the different options, that gives a better result. Goal setting theory by Locke and Latham show that when a collaborative goal setting process takes place, it is far more likely for that individual to succeed at those goals rather than have a goal set on them that might not work. And then the final piece is which option are they going to choose? When are they going to put that process into effect? And when is the review going to be? When is that going to be looked at again? Booking your next check-in appointment so that you can sort of monitor the progress between what has been identified as a solution and if that's working or whether it needs tweaking. So we talked about that two-way feedback, how important it is, looking at what the barriers might be from the employee and what the needs are of the organisation or that service. But there is a caveat with two-way feedback. There needs to be psychological safety so people can raise their thoughts and their opinions. When Google had a look at what made a high-performing team, in their project Aristotle, they found the highest performing teams were those with the highest level of psychological safety. And Amy Edmondson has wrote about psychological safety extensively. So we also see some research by Dedru, who talks about keeping tensions embedded in the process rather than tensions spilling out into relationships. So we can talk about what those barriers might look like for individuals or a team. Is it systems or processes that are not fit for purpose any longer? And what could some solutions be? And that means that you look at the root cause of problems and you can find solutions that help with continuous improvement. However, people need to feel safe in raising their opinion, raising where they feel things are not working well. So psychological safety is really important for continuous improvement in an organisation. For more on tackling difficult conversations, you can re-watch our Difficult Conversations webinar, which is available on demand. So if you've watched our webinars before, you will have heard us talk about WORK, which is our people systems framework and diagnostic tool. WORK was originally created as a reasonable adjustment pathway, but has been expanded for a complete people systems approach. And WORK really reinforces good performance coaching culture across the employee life cycle. And it also helps managers to understand what conversations are helpful at each stage of the employee life cycle. So we can look at welcome, which is going to be one of the most critical points with the change in legislation of unfair dismissal rights. So we need to get that welcome piece right, setting those clear expectations through that expectations conversation. And we can use job descriptions to set objectives. We can look at the induction process. We can make sure our employees are really clear on what that probation process looks like, what the check-in, how regular they'll be checking in with their manager, at what points they need to be meeting certain objectives, and what the progress will be. What does success look like in that role? How can an employee feel confident that they're going to meet and pass their probation? Then we have E for Empower, which is your day-to-day supervision and support. And in this particular lens, it is around regular check-ins and supervisions, and we can have those feedback conversations. How is somebody progressing against their objectives? Are they meeting the clear expectations that you've set? And the SBI or FBI feedback conversation doesn't always need to be around performance improvement. It can also be around recognition. If somebody has achieved something particularly well on one of their objectives, you can use that framework to say what the situation was that they did really well, what the behaviour was that you observed, perhaps embodying your organisational values, and what the impact was, perhaps for your team or for the customer. And then we can use those coaching conversations of being able to find solutions and help support people to meet their expectations and to meet those set objectives, and having those objectives reviewed regularly and looking if there is any further training that's required. Refine is the area where we would review role expectations. It's a fast-paced working environment in the modern workplace, and things change quickly, and roles might change quickly, and expectations may need to be reset. There may need to be conversations around upskilling and development, and we can use those coaching conversations to do that. And we can also use that to act on feedback. So if people tell you about perhaps things that are not working so well, it's an area where we can make refinements to that role. And keep is really about how we build trust and retain our team members. We've invested a lot of time into our team with training, and we certainly don't want to be losing members of our team who are working well. So again, we can look at what their development pathways might be, what's their career progression in the organisation, and what do they need in terms of training to fill those gaps. So how does it work in practice? It sounds easy in theory, but we know that in busy workplaces, it's always more challenging to put these interventions in place. So we'll use our own journey as a case study. When I arrived in the organisation, we found our people and culture was not as we would have wanted. Managers were technically brilliant, but had been moved into managerial positions without really any upskilling of people skills that they now needed as part of their role. I also saw that supervisions were not consistent across the organisation. Some teams had really robust supervision and check-ins, other teams had none at all. Staff were not always feeling heard or feeling valued. Perhaps they only heard improvement feedback rather than coaching feedback. And we also found that people who joined us within the first 12 months were leaving within those 12 months, which is a real drain on your own resources, but it also spoke to our induction was not as robust as it could be. So we also saw performance and quality challenges. So, not surprisingly, our quality scores were inconsistent. If people are not having consistent supervisions, that is a perfect correlation. We also found that teams were siloed with no sharing of best practice. Conflict management was avoided and unrecorded. And when we started to measure that, we could see that there was a lot of cost related to avoiding those early conversations. And we were also seeing a high appeal rate on any HR processes, which told me that people were finding performance management a surprise. They hadn't had that early conversations. So we, taking a diagnostic approach to our organisational challenges, we put two clear interventions in place. So one of those was making sure that every team carried out quality supervisions. Managers received training in how to do this, and we tracked the number of supervisions that were being carried out across the organisation. And we could see that as the supervision practice improved, that also improved the quality performance in our organisation. So good supervision correlates with high performance. We also looked at upskilling our line managers. It's very unfair to promote people into a people management position when they have never had the skills to be able to carry that part out of their role. So we developed a leadership program. And this helped us close the gap between what our policies said and what actually happened in practice. And we had some really positive results from this leadership program. The two that was positive for me was the peer rated improvement. So people who were managed by that line manager were able to feed back how their leadership skills had improved. So for me, that was the real test. What was it being seen in the organisation? And people had a leadership profile at the end of the development programme and helped with their self-awareness of how they led their people and was able to tailor their leadership styles to suit individuals. So without training, with training, leadership development and support, we had a new manager who was internally promoted, helped them effectively navigate a tricky probation management performance issue and a subsequent grievance that was raised. And because they had had the support, we successfully navigated this issue with no lasting effects on the organisation. And most notably, there was no subsequent appeal, and none of the formal grievances was upheld, which showed that the manager was able to consistently and fairly apply those processes. The service is now recognised as a regional exemplar, taking the learnings from this experience and being able to improve our recruitment and induction processes. So by taking a diagnostic approach to our challenges, we made effective interventions that demonstrated significant return on our investment. We saw the costs of conflict reduce right down. So that was measuring the amount of sickness absence, which we found most people who were having long-term absence was related to some performance management issue. So we saw that come right down. We also seen the retention of our staff improve significantly. So we were able to reduce the cost of conflicts within the organisation. And for every pound that we invested in our leadership development programme, we saved £5, well, nearly £6 in conflict costs. One of the most important results out of this is that our appeal rates dropped to zero, and we had no employment tribunal processes out of our HR formal processes, which showed that our managers were able to apply these practices fairly and confidently across the organisation. And taking a performance coaching approach really helped us to support all of our staff members in a positive way. So the three takeaways from this webinar to help you prepare for the unfair dismissal protections in January 2027. One is to audit your supervision practice. Are conversations happening? Do your managers understand how to apply probation policies? Are they confident in having those early conversations? And are they confident in being able to set clear expectations and review those goals and have early performance conversations confidently? You can watch our difficult conversation webinar, which is on demand. That gives you some great tactics and techniques in being able to have those conversations confidently. Number two is training your managers in providing coaching feedback. So a practical conversation structure they can use. So the effective conversations, the feedback conversations, and the coaching conversations. And we can also re-watch the supporting well-being through practical adjustments, which is really useful that when you have those two-way dialogues, if there are any issues that your team members may be struggling with that need some kind of practical adjustments, your managers are confident in being able to navigate that. Number three is getting a diagnostic view of your performance culture. So this will help you take a targeted approach and maximize your return on investment. A structured diagnosis will tell you where your friction sits and what interventions are going to be most useful for you going forward. And that will help you prepare for the employment rights changes. So if today has resonated, the first easy step to get clarity is our work friction finder. It's accessible at just £200 and it helps you to find where friction may sit in your organisation. Is it in your welcome? Is it in your daily supportive conversations? Or is it within learning and adjustment and retention of staff? This will help you prioritise which policies that you need to review first and what training gaps that you might need to close. It's suitable for CEOs, HR leads, or senior managers and trustees to get involved in. And if you have any questions about this webinar or any other of our webinars, we welcome you to get in touch with us and we'll be happy to help. So the full picture of our series of HR in Action webinars can be found on our YouTube playlist. You can use the QR to go straight there, and you can have a reminder of what the changes are in the Employment Right Bill, how we can take practical steps to have those early conversations, how we can support well-being through practical adjustments, how we can help our employees attend work effectively, and how we can recruit inclusively and build diverse workforces. So I encourage you to start with clarity, maximise your own time and investment. Formal processes are very stressful, time consuming, and helping you to take a very early approach in reviewing your HR processes and practices is going to be a game changer. We found that for ourselves as an organisation, and we will be really happy to talk to you about the challenges that you may be having too. So please do get in touch, and you can provide feedback about this webinar using the QR code. You can join us through our various social media channels, and you can also contact us directly from our website. Thank you for listening. I hope you got some interesting feedback from today that helps you prepare effectively for the Employment Rights Act changes.